So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar, Climate Change and the New Reality of Urban Displacement, Risks and Opportunities. My name is Lucy Earle, and I'm a Principal Researcher in the Human Settlements Group at the International Institute for Environment and Development, IIED. So can we have the first slide, please? So I want to draw your attention to this slide. Please note that the webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded to the BCSC2 playlist on YouTube. It'll be linked to the BCSC website and advertised on their newsletter. So if you do not want to be recorded, can I ask you to please sign out now from the live event, and then you can revisit the recording when it's posted. If you have a question you'd like to put to the panelists, please use the Q&A function. You can click the like button to upvote the question and to show that you really want that one to be answered. And please note also that the chat function has been disabled. And for the best webinar experience, please close all non-essential apps on your device, particularly messaging apps. So I don't think you can see them yet, but I know that I'm joined by Lamia Rashid, Catherine Loon-Grayson, Ebru Genser, Karen Hertz, and Jay Patel, our panelists. And I will give full introductions to each of them before they speak. But before handing over to our first speaker, I want to situate the discussions we're about to have. So as an urbanist, I started working around 7 years ago on the issue of urban displacement. I'm under the impression that the world has realized that forcibly displaced people are in towns and cities. You often see reference to statistics around the number of internally displaced people in urban areas. So people who have been forcibly uprooted from their homes and lives, but haven't crossed an international border, so people who are not refugees. So these figures are upwards of 50% in urban areas, some say as many as 80%. And those are the people that can be more or less counted or estimated. It's very difficult to know who has moved where and whether or not they've gone home. But these are people that might have been displaced by a big shock, like a flood or a climate event. But some will have been displaced by conflict. And then there are those who've been displaced by a combination of factors. But alongside the people that can be more or less counted in this way, others who might be viewed by some as economic migrants, people who have depended on rural livelihoods, but those are gradually being impacted by changing climates. And this is a kind of climate displacement that has a much slower, more insidious trigger, as it were. And some people may move preemptively before things get impossible. And there you might see migration to an urban area as an adaptation strategy. But while the world is recognizing that people are on the move to urban areas, often the city or the urban area focus is a bit of a backdrop in policy documents. It's mentioned in the introduction, but there's a lot we don't know about the experience of migrants and IDPs in urban areas. And often those policy documents and research reports don't really go into those details. There's a lot of unanswered questions, and I know that we're going to hear about that from our panelists today. But questions such as, is this a definitive move to an urban area, or is it a circular one? What kind of links, financial or social, remain with those left behind? And then what are the experience of these people in the city itself? So often new arrivals will find shelter where they can, in the places where it's cheapest to live, and those will generally be informal settlements where land is irregularly or illegally occupied. And those areas are often on marginal land, and the reason they're not occupied by the people is because they might be on the outskirts of cities, or land that is unsuitable for housing because of flooding, risk of landslides, coastal erosion, etc. And there's a risk of these people being secondarily displaced. Also in these places, access to services can already be under pressure, and this may generate tensions with existing residents. And those tensions in turn can be exacerbated by discrimination against new arrivals, particularly if they belong to minority ethnic groups or minority religions. But there are also other types of violence and insecurity in urban areas. The violence of everyday life as a low-income person in a city in the global south might experience, for example, police harassment that can be made worse if recent migrants lack documentation or residence permits. The violence of overcrowding and poor quality housing and lack of access to medical care or clean water or schooling for their children. And then the threat of eviction that hangs over many hundreds of thousands of people on a daily basis. We know IIED's research has shown that some people in the slums of Nairobi are paying more per square meter for where they live than some of the fanciest middle-class neighborhoods. So I'm going to hand over to our first speaker in a moment, and our presenters are going to provide insight into some of these challenges, and also I hope some promising examples of how urban communities can be better prepared for climate change and for migration. And their interventions will cover a range of themes, including urban peace and resilience building, ensuring growing urban environments are healthy environments, and how climate change mitigation through regeneration and green jobs can offset the loss of rural livelihoods and contribute to urban resilience. So our first speaker is Catherine Loon-Grayson, and she joined the ICSC as a policy advisor in 2016. And her work focuses on the experience of populations affected by armed conflict and violence and humanitarian practices, notably in the context of migration, internal displacement, and the climate crisis. So over to you, Catherine Loon.
Lucy, thank you so much for this absolutely brilliant overview. I'll try adding a few elements to that discussion. What I would like to do in the next few minutes is bringing together some of the conclusions that we've made through two different pieces of research over the last few years. So in the last 3 years or so, we carried out a piece of research that looked into urban displacement caused by conflict or violence, looking into people's experiences and looking into how to improve the response. And then we did something similar in looking at the humanitarian consequences of combined climate risks and armed conflict on people's lives. And once again, looking at how do we better respond to people's needs. In both cases, we carried out case studies in the Middle East, in Africa, and when it came to urban displacement in Central America as well. So it's a first attempt to bring those two bodies of research together, and I'll do that through a few simple steps. I'd first like to focus on the consequences of conflicts on societies, and allow me a parenthesis here. I'm focusing on armed conflict because this is where we work as the ICRC. I do fully appreciate that we can be speaking of violence in a much broader sense, so I'll be using a slightly more narrow lens, looking really into the consequences of conflict on people and societies. I'll then bring into the equation what climate risks has as an impact in those settings. And finally, I'll bring in the dimension of urban displacement. I'm afraid I will not be offering many solutions, but I will try at the end to conclude by a few remarks on avenues to better meet people's needs, but also flagging a few blind spots where I think we need to be developing a greater understanding. As I said, it's a first attempt to bring these two bodies of work together. So I'm absolutely convinced that by the end of the discussion, I'll have to revisit some of those preliminary thoughts. So what happens in wars? We all know that conflicts not only cause deaths and injuries, they also profoundly disrupt the foundations of societies. They erode development, they weaken institutions, they harm the environment on which people rely to survive. This increases the vulnerability of those who are already vulnerable and also creates new vulnerabilities. These vulnerabilities explain why 60% of the countries that are considered the most vulnerable and the least ready to adapt to climate change by the NDGAIN index are countries in situation of conflict. This overlap does not result from a direct correlation between climate change and conflict, but from the limited adaptive capacity of societies that are enduring conflict. And a useful way to think about it is to picture layers of vulnerability that compound one another. And there I can use the example of the effects on health as an example. So conflicts will impede the work of health personnel. They will compromise health structures and supply chains at a time when health needs are increasing because of injuries, because of food insecurity, because of the spread of diseases. Now, when climate change comes into the equation, it can further exacerbate food insecurity. It can also destroy health centers or supply chains in extreme weather events and create fertile grounds for certain diseases. So what we see there is health needs growing while health systems are disrupted. I would argue that we see such effects when we combine climate risks, environmental degradation, and conflict. We see effects on all dimensions of people's lives, ranging from their safety to their health, to their food, water, or economic security. We also see that conflicts can very directly hinder people's coping mechanisms. Think, for instance, of this example in northern Mali, where we carried out a part of the field research. This is a place where, in peace times, in the face of a bad season, livestock herders will normally travel longer distances with their animals to find grazing land and water. This way of coping becomes impossible when conflict prevents herders from moving safely with their animals to find grazing land and water. This is often a case where conflict will also limit the ability of the state to provide support and humanitarian access. So what we see is herders trapped in place, watching their most valuable asset wither. Some who have lost everything will end up moving to cities or to greener areas. Now, adapting to a changing climate can be relatively simple. In some cases, we're speaking of a change in crops, but in most cases, it requires major changes. We may be looking into a whole agricultural system that needs to be adapted, for instance. In times of war, concerted and long-term efforts tend to be limited because authorities are weak, and in addition, they tend to be preoccupied with other priorities, namely security. In the absence of institutional support, people try to cope by changing or diversifying their livelihoods and to some extent adapting their way of life. But there we see that in the absence of other options, many people will end up moving, most often within their own countries, often towards cities, and also towards greener areas in some countries. And that would be the case in Mali. Let me unpack this displacement or this movement dimension for a minute. So people, if we take the Mali example, will move to or within city to find safety, livelihoods, access to services, social networks, and maybe some assistance. In practice, they tend to receive limited support. They often struggle to meet their basic needs, to secure adequate housing, and to find a reliable livelihood. As Lucy flagged, they will often end up in poor urban areas where they continue to be exposed to hazards. It's rather clear that with adequate administrative and legal support and relatively little assistance, many would be able to regain their autonomy and normalize their situation, but this is often not forthcoming. Let's consider for a second the example of southern Iraq, where a strong and long tradition of farming has been deeply impacted by water scarcity and environmental degradation, and by the limited capacity of the state to maintain infrastructure and provide support to farmers. And there, when I speak of the limited capacity of the state, I would like to connect that with the effects of conflict. So when soils became too salty to farm, a number of farmers turned to fishing. Others, with greater means, managed to change irrigation methods and crops. But as livelihood options for people without specialized skills are very limited, for many, the only way to cope has been to move to cities. Yet what we see there is that many have not been able to settle permanently as they lack the institutional support to do so. So some end up moving on a fairly regular basis because they're not able to settle permanently in a specific location. Now I want to take a step back here, and I'm aware that time is running out very soon. Allow me 2 extra minutes probably, or 1 extra minute. So what is triggering displacement in a case like that? We know that extreme weather events can drive displacement and secondary displacement. When we're looking, and this is not what I described with Iraq, when we're looking at slow onset disasters, these can lead to displacement. Think of Somalia or South Sudan, for instance, where droughts do induce displacement. Now, what is at play here is the very limited capacity of institutions to provide support. Now, if we keep looking at slow onset disasters and long-term changes to the environment, we can also see that they can induce migration in the longer run. And I mean, that is probably what's happening in the case of Iraq. And there, this is where I was flagging that in the absence of proper support, we do end up with people in a very precarious situation. And I'm sure we'll go deeper into that in the discussion. Now, I wanted to close by 3 remarks, and I'm sorry if this is slightly rushed. I want to note that while this discussion is focusing on climate-induced urban displacement, the distinctions between what is induced by climate risks and a situation of conflict is not always obvious to make. I mean, there's the question of the fragility of institutions that very often comes into play. So I think there we really have to be careful with oversimplifying. We need to understand the multiple factors that interact and may lead to displacement. Secondly, when it comes to climate risks in conflict settings, the focus remains too often on rural areas. And I really think that, at least when in situations of conflict, and I think there really has to be an effort to look more closely into risks in urban areas, and an effort to look into how do we help people normalize their situation in the face of multiple risks. And this includes considerations on addressing legal or administrative obstacles. The last point I would like to make here is those gaps in our knowledge and research need to be connected with the development of tools and guidance on how to do better in that type of urban areas. And I'll close here. It's a bit of a rushed wrap up, but I'm happy to continue the discussion as we move forward into the panel. Thank you.
Katrina, thanks so much. That was a great way to start off our discussion with this, highlighting the complexity of why people move, and also the complexity of that movement itself. I was struck by the example you gave of the herders unable to use their normal adaptive techniques because of conflict, but then the fact that once they have ended up in an urban center, they may not be able to settle there. And I can understand there's a real gap in understanding and those experiences and the support that's necessary for people who have spent their lifetimes in agriculture being able to adapt to the urban environment. And I'm so glad that you said that we don't look enough at urban areas and the risks within them. I spend a lot of time banging that drum about thinking urban, and it's great to hear other people echoing that. So our next speaker is someone who comes from an organization that's done a really quite fantastic work on integrating urban issues into its programming. So Lamia Rashid is from the IRC, and she joined them as Deputy Regional Director in January this year. She leads support for strategy planning, program quality, emergency preparedness and response, research and innovation, measurement and business development across 7 country programs in the Horn and East of Africa. So it makes her sound incredibly busy. So thank you for joining us. And I will hand over to you now. Thanks, Lamia.
Thank you. Not too busy for this very important discussion. So yeah, I think a lot of the things that you've said earlier, Lucy, and my colleague earlier, tie nicely to what I'll be talking about, of course, complexities in urban migration and climate change, particularly in East Africa. So the focus of IRC's work is really very much on people whose lives and livelihoods have been affected by crisis, and certainly climate. The climate crisis is probably the biggest one that we are seeing today. And we have a new strategy that's just coming out in a few days' time, where we will be really taking climate change into consideration across all the different programs. So the next slide on East Africa. Yes, thank you. No, sorry, the East Africa slide. Thanks. So in East Africa in particular, the region is already prone to natural hazards and floods, droughts, landslides, as well as the secondary impacts of these in terms of disease and epidemics. But the episodes of droughts and floods, in particular in the region associated with climate change, is certainly on the rise in terms of frequency, magnitude, as well as intensity. And sudden onset disasters are definitely increasing in East Africa due to climate impacts. And these increased natural disasters, rising sea levels, prolonged droughts, unpredictable rain patterns are really driving increased migration and displacement. And the IRC has been working very much with a focus on conflict-related displacement, but we're now seeing a lot more displacement related to these natural disasters. And with the humanitarian sector, we're better understanding the significance that climate change is playing as a driver of displacement. Also in terms of rural communities, I think, Lucy, you said that as well, that the lack of viability or the decreasing viability of rural livelihoods and agriculture is also kind of pushing migration into urban settings. And the new displacements associated with these sudden onset disasters has tripled in the last 10 years, from 167,000 in 2008 to 635,000 in 2016, for example. And in East Africa in particular, about 68% of the population is projected to be living in the urban areas by 2050. And in 2010, the rate was already exceeding 21%. And finally, in terms of context, the 30 fastest growing cities in the world between 2005 and 2010 were in the Greater Horn in East Africa, with Nairobi, where I am now, at 37, almost 38%, and Kampala at almost 36%. Next slide. So I want to share with you this graph, which comes from a 2017 systematic review of the drivers of violence against the urban displaced. And this is really going to set the tone for looking at the complexities, which colleagues have already mentioned. So the review found that violence against the urban displaced really persists across the different socioeconomic levels, but especially at the community level, where violence is prevalent in cities through discrimination, fractured social networks, and violence resulting from overburdened city infrastructure. And I'll share an example related to this later on in the presentation. But this really means that resilience has to be addressed at all the different levels. At individual level, particularly with girls and women, we need to support their overall well-being, build social linkages, work skills, leadership capacities, and having social protection systems really helps a lot in building this level of resilience. At community level, we're building sustainable, high-functioning social networks and safety nets, working with local organizations and associations, and really promoting diversified livelihoods in local economies with a broad participation amongst the communities that we work with. And at economy, government, institutional level, really building resilience through some of the advocacy and influencing with to reduce macroeconomic vulnerability, building inclusive and accountable governance and institutions that really empower women and make use of knowledge and technology. And finally, at all levels, we are working with others to build resilience by conserving, maintaining, and restoring the natural ecosystems. Next slide. So the Climate Action Plan is really, of IRC, is focused around programming, learning, and advocacy, as I just said. Our programmatic work is still developing, but we are already implementing programs that address climate resilience. But we want to become more strategic and really integrate climate resilience across all the different sectors. At the moment, we do have climate resilience work incorporated into our social cohesion programs, our livelihood programs, which then lead back into climate resilience, but we want to make sure that that's addressed across all the programs. And we want to go beyond the traditional humanitarian response, which is often short-term, and take a much longer-term perspective on resilience building. Next slide. In the emergency preparedness work, we're already, of course, taking actions on problems and issues arising from climate change. As I said earlier, the rainfall patterns are very unpredictable across East Africa, and our emergency program often responds to emergencies that are caused by climate impacts or environmental changes. And you know, the IRC has been reacting to emergencies that are caused by more frequent natural disasters, like the droughts, floods, and disease outbreaks in the region, and more recently, the desert locusts that you've probably all heard about. And all of these are related to the rainfall performance and the unpredictable rain patterns. So we have the system of emergency preparedness plans, which are really based on looking at information from a number of sources, like FuseNet, EGAD, the regional modeling centers, World Meteorological Association, and other climate information platforms, and really using that to build scenarios about likelihoods, severity of hazards, and trying to pre-position resources at country level. But the next step is really moving beyond humanitarian preparedness for what will be increasing frequency of shocks, and really what we're doing now is to work to prepare communities themselves more to become resilient to climate change themselves. Next slide. The two examples that I'll share after this are taking off from our learning in urban context and climate action, and how that looks in urban context. So three kind of key principles that we've learned from urban programming is to look at complexity, and to address complexity, we're trying to do multi-sectoral analysis that really tries to understand the vulnerabilities and the root causes of vulnerabilities in the diverse urban groups that we work with in the diverse communities, and really to try and identify the existing services, systems, and stakeholders that are there through mapping and stakeholder analysis, gender analysis, market assessments, but also trying to build in the climate change impacts and environmental assessments into these context analysis to really understand the full urban complexity. Secondly, to try to make sure that we are prioritizing coordination and collaboration with the existing actors in the urban context, and also advocating with city governments and trying to influence city development plans to look at environmental sustainability and climate resilient goals. And thirdly, to really support recovery, resilience, and social cohesion by bringing together all the different groups that live in a community and support social cohesion, and looking at the vulnerability across the different groups, so that we're not just supporting one particular group like a displaced population, but all the different groups cohesively in a community. Next slide. So this is the first of two examples that I want to conclude with. The IRC has been working with this urban climate action approach in Kampala. We did a comprehensive urban context analysis in 2017, supported by the Kampala Capital City Authority, KCCA, collaborating with them. And we really started by working in various livelihoods programs there. And through this approach, we really got to understand the needs and preferences of Kampala's refugees and the low-income informal neighborhoods in which they live, as well as to understand the capacity and willingness of the KCC as a long-term partner. Based on this foundation, we're really able to develop ambitious and exciting 5-year program that's going to address urban refugee livelihoods, both in Kampala as well as in Nairobi. And in Kampala, continuing to work with the KCCA, as well as community organizations, refugee-led organizations, and really trying to use livelihoods as an entry point to developing greater social cohesion between the refugee and Ugandan populations, as well as addressing climate resilience in those neighborhoods and promoting green livelihoods opportunities, working with private sector and other actors in those communities. So this work, doing the context analysis in 2017 then enabled us to really develop this larger urban livelihoods program that's looking at green livelihoods as well. The last slide, please. And another example is some work that we've been already implementing in Somalia as well as in DRC, supported by CEDA, and really contributing to their to CEDA's strategy for sustainable peace, looking at kind of the triple nexus of humanitarian development, peace, and this conflict prevention peacebuilding program in Somalia works in 2 districts, and the main idea is to really ensure formal and informal justice providers have greater capacity to protect the right to a fair trial, as well as to ensure greater demand by citizens in the 2 target districts in Somalia for safe justice services. And so the broader work of the project is really trying to focus on both the formal and informal justice systems, as well as disseminating information on the justice referral pathways and providing means at community level through peace committees to be able to resolve different kinds of conflicts. So the example that I want to share from this program is about the urban migration in these 2 districts has really increased conflict over land rights and led to a strain on public services, in particular the sewer system. So we conducted a conflict sensitivity analysis last year, and that revealed that one of the key drivers of conflict in the districts is the lack of a proper drainage system, and that unregulated building in areas that were demarcated as public lands and improperly disposed of household waste was resulting in blocked sewage and also flooding, and that was leading to conflict between neighbors. So we were able to use the justice referral pathways and work with the peace committees and really create community-based conflict mitigation plans, which is the picture that you see there of a meeting where they're developing and discussing the conflict mitigation plans. And their activities really address the poor sanitation. For example, if a family was placing their garbage at the entrance of another family and this was leading to an escalation in conflict, then the community-based mitigation plans, as well as the peace committees, were able to serve as a platform for engaging the community, but also linking with the local government and influence decision-making at a higher level. So I'll leave it there and look forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Lamia. Something that struck me that is really important to bear in mind was a comment you made about the long-term view, and I think there's a tendency still for humanitarians to engage in short-term action. That's often the way that their funding is also structured, that humanitarian projects are 3 to 6 months, and actually these processes we're talking about, urbanization and climate change, these are not issues that can be dealt with a short-term program. This requires a completely different mindset. And I know that colleagues of Catherine Loon's and the ICRC are also take this very different view around how you support urban services in the long term, given also the protracted nature of many conflicts. And one of the slides I think we're probably going to return to, or I hope we return to, is the slide that you put up just now, is the slide where you talked to us about the 3 things we need to do: the planning for urban complexity, prioritizing coordination, and supporting recovery and resilience. And I think that was a really important overview of what I think the next couple of speakers are going to be talking about. We're going to get some more in-depth studies now from our next two speakers. And I think that this issue around complexity and working with different actors and supporting the resilience and recovery is going to come through quite strongly. So I would like now to turn to Ebru Gencer, who's our next speaker. She's an urban planner specialized in disaster risk reduction, resilience and sustainable urban development. And she is the founding executive director of the Center for Urban Disaster Risk Reduction and Resilience, which is a non-profit research center based in New York City. And she's also an adjunct professor of architecture, planning and preservation at Columbia University. So thank you, Ebru.
Thank you very much, Lucy, for the introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. As Lucy said, I would like to approach the topic of climate and urban insecurities from a very specific perspective, and today from the perspective of social resilience as a solution and an essential component of building resilience for climate change. And I will discuss it through a specific project at my center, CUDRR, along with our partners, IID Latin America and Altera from the University of Twente have undertaken together in the city of Santa Ana in El Salvador. To start with, I would like to go over what I mean by social resilience. Social resilience is the ability of a community or society to resist, absorb, accommodate, adapt to, and recover from the effects of hazards, shocks, or stresses in a timely and efficient manner, while at the same time transforming itself towards sustainability. Basically, it involves the society to move towards a positive direction while at the same time becoming more resilient. And Catherine and Lamy have also touched base upon this subject through the discussion of people's resilience and communities' resilience. Several actions can increase social resilience in a community, increased empowerment, knowledge, particularly through transparent communication, and social capital through social cohesion, trust, and shared identity. In our project, we started from this perspective and tried to develop a methodology in which we could make use of local data, increase knowledge through transparent risk communication, and increase empowerment through active participation of stakeholders in the decision-making processes. We undertook this project in 3 cities in Latin America, all of which went through different processes because of the different contexts and the different interests of the stakeholders involved. But today I'll talk specifically about our project in Santa Ana, El Salvador. Santa Ana is the second largest city in El Salvador with about 265,000 people, 83% of them urban. There is high urban poverty due to lack of job opportunities. There is little to no agricultural production in the city, and most existing economy is informal. About 18,000 people, for instance, daily commute to San Salvador, to the capital every day for work, to find work opportunities. Crime and lack of economic opportunities are seen as the biggest problems in the city. They make the coherent of urban insecurities in the city. As for climatological hazards and risks, in recent years, the new urbanization schemes that you see from the diagram in the Southern Hills, where previously coffee production had prevailed, have prevented water infiltration and created runoffs in the city, together with outdated infrastructure, garbage throwing in the ravines. There are overflows, making the city more vulnerable to heavy rain and flooding, which have been occurring more frequently in the last years. In addition, there is log burning and arson by gangs that have also increased landslides. And we developed this this diagram from the perspective of the stakeholders that we have interviewed. And the diagram shows that from the Southern Hills, there is like water runoff that goes to the inner city and the northern areas where most of the urban poor live, basically increasing their vulnerabilities and risk even further. Next, please. So how should we think of building climate resilience in a city that's suffering from the conjunction of these climatological risks and other urban insecurities, the topic of our discussion today, the stressors such as urban poverty, gang violence, inadequate governance mechanisms, lack of coherent planning strategies, and that only address day-to-day responses to risks. So we started our project with stakeholder mapping in order to understand and receive the views of most actors that are involved in urban development and risk management in the city. I believe this was similar to IRC's integrated methodology of doing stakeholder mapping and bringing the stakeholders together. From the stakeholder mapping that you see on the left, you can see that the connections between them show that there was indeed a disconnect between the municipality, which you see in the orange circle, and between the municipality and other organizations such as community organizations, NGOs, academic organizations, and the private sector. But also there was also apparently no collaboration among the different departments working under the same municipality. So there was a lack of both horizontal and vertical integration. Being only facilitators to this process and understanding that any solutions to climate resilience and urban resilience should come from the community itself and the institutions involved, we started by discussing these issues with all the stakeholders, including the city officials. And first, we organized an open awareness session to the city about climate change. And this was an open awareness session that was open to all city residents. Following that, we undertook a 2-day workshop with all the stakeholders that we have identified in the stakeholder mapping. And we had also interviewed them individually. Next slide, please. In the workshop, using the data collected and the decision-making platform that was developed by our partner Alterra, we were able to involve all the stakeholders that we had brought together to develop risk mapping and discuss their perception and solutions toward how to make the Santa Ana more resilient and also an equitable development for the future. And according to the discussions that we have made and the solutions that the stakeholders, the participants have offered, it was apparent that that climate risks in the city were very intertwined with the social, economic, and as well as the cultural conditions that were on the ground. And all of the solutions needed to also include these elements, social, economic, cultural elements. Some of the stakeholder ideas focused on new economic opportunities, for instance, to improve socio-economic conditions, which ultimately would also have an effect on climate resilience. For instance, the participants discussed that, for instance, protecting coffee hills in southern hills could increase tourism in the city and have co-benefits, increasing both socio-economic resilience and also ultimately climate resilience as well. Other ideas included privatizing municipal services such as garbage collection, physical actions, or nature-based solutions such as reforestation projects. But perhaps most importantly, understanding that the need to strengthen participatory and collaborative work on climate resilience needed to include all of the stakeholders. Participants decided to continue the discussion beyond this 2-day workshop that we had organized, and they have decided to form what they called climate change mesas or roundtables, and to meet regularly to discuss issues related to risk and development in their city. Next slide, please. So following the workshop, stakeholders, including the officials and technicians from the municipality, civil society members, and other stakeholders that had participated in the workshop, formed these climate change mesas, the roundtables. And the mesas were led by our local partner, Unpulmanmaz. It was a civil society organization. And in the following 4 months, they met several times in order to discuss a portfolio of options in the city. Yes, thank you. So in these climate change methods, in the discussions, they have decided on 2 projects for the city. And this was all done by the stakeholders, including the civil society organizations on the ground. So the first project was about flood awareness and signaling campaign, which would take place during the rainy season. They would develop signs where overflows occur, where residents should not throw garbage, and basically increasing overall awareness in the city. And this project was found feasible by all stakeholders, and the private sector representative was able to finance the project and help implement it. The second project was to develop a planning norm for the long term to guarantee more equitable and resilient development in the city. But of course, here, this project was not immediately feasible because it needs to bring all of the power brokers in the city, including upper class residents, private developers, and gangs, all of whom were benefiting from the new development schemes in the city. But it was an idea to start a conversation, giving this new awareness and desire from stakeholders. Last slide, please. So in conclusion, I would like to reiterate that social resilience is an essential component of building climate resilience. Empowerment, social capacity, and solidarity provide communities with the ability to self-organize, adjust to stresses, and increase their capacities. However, we need to stress that participatory methodology and tools that are used should be transparent and flexible and ensure the genuine participation of stakeholders. And dialogue and participation spaces are also essential to allow for such conversations to occur, to support both social resilience and ultimately climate resilience. Thank you.
Thanks, Ebru. It's great to just focus on just one city for a few minutes and to get the richness of the discussion. And of course, I'm thrilled that you are working with IID's sister organization, IID America Latina. So something that struck me from your presentation was the way you kind of highlighted the complexity of climate risks and how they're combined with the social, economic, and cultural conditions that are being experienced in the city. And I think that's a really important point to make. And you also mentioned gangs, which I don't think we have mentioned yet. And obviously that depends which part of the world you're working in. But in certain parts of the world, for example, in Central America, that's a core reason to induce movement out of or between cities as people seek to flee sort of gang violence and repercussions of family members' activities in gangs. So I think it's important to highlight that in some parts of the world that's a core issue, both for people sort of leaving one place and what might happen to them in the place where they arrive. And I thought your signage project was very interesting, because one of the things that also struck me for new migrants or forcibly displaced people arriving into a city and moving into somewhere like we have on the screen there, moving into what looks like an informal settlement. If you haven't lived there long or you're new, you don't know what's going to happen in the rainy season, and you may not have the networks and the connections with other people who can explain to you, well, if you put up a shack there, you're going to get washed away. And I think that kind of risk information, the risk communication is really important. So it's fascinating to see how that was actually a priority also of the community you were working with. So I'm going to hand over to our next speaker now, who's going to take us to Bangladesh. Her name is Karen. Sorry, I just need to bring up my bio sheet so I can not make a mistake about her background. But so Karen Hetz is a team lead at GIZ and manages the urban management of internal migration due to climate change project. And this is the first project funded by the German government to explicitly link climate migration and urban development. And it targets 47 slums in Bangladesh. So Karen, over to you. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much also for this kind introduction and for giving me the opportunity to present here on behalf of GIZ. So my presentation will be on climate change and urban displacement. And I'll give a bit of an overview of the context in which we work, some challenges that we face, some recommendations drawn from a number of projects from the GIZ around the world that look into urban displacement, and then I zoom into our illustrative case from Bangladesh. So next slide, please. I mean, we know this wars, conflicts, and also natural disasters increasingly lead into an increase of migrants to float into the cities. Today, the majority of refugees and IDPs live in cities already, and we know that they are there for longer term. So it's not a short-term situation. The GCR, the Sustainable Development Goals, and the UN Habitat Urban Agenda speak to these realities. Next slide, please. I'd rather like to focus a bit more on the challenges. I mean, we have on the one hand some pre-existing challenges, some common urbanization challenges, and I mean they've been referred to already before. We have service delivery issues such as access to water, waste management, public services, housing, you name it. And this is in particular a challenge when this growth informal or migration into the city takes place in an informal way. Where we have the IDPs, our climate migrants, refugees being limited or constrained to slums, be it informal structures in the peri-urban or be it informal like slums in the inner city areas such as public buildings which are occupied. We also know that there is a risk of social tensions between host communities and displaced persons. So this is challenges that we have always faced in the framework of this unplanned growth or increased growth of cities in the global south. But we also have challenges that add to this, that are very specific to this urban displacement context. First of all, we know that it's much harder to identify displaced persons in the city and to reach them the targeted services than, for instance, in a situation where we have camps. We also know about the protection risks, be it in view of detention, deportation, that these refugees, IDPs are exposed to. And 2 points that I would like to highlight in particular is that we have, so to say, constrained urban mandates. So we have municipalities that are really at the forefront of responding to urban displacement. And at the same time, they are very much dependent on national policies that look into migration and refugee issues, be it in terms of access to social services or work permits. And to some extent, we also have a lack of knowledge on the particular needs of these climate migrants and displaced persons in the cities, so that we also face challenges to address them in particular. Next slide, please. So what are some, let's say, general recommendations that we drew from a number of TSF projects? I mean, of course, we need to have a multi-sectoral approach. I mean, urban displacement is a multifaceted issue, and it requires that we look into education, infrastructure, water, sanitation, housing, and in particular as well, the livelihood sector. That's a very important aspect. The next one is that we also need to emphasize that that there's a combination of short-term humanitarian aid with long-term development policies and also peace-building initiatives. So there also needs to be a link between these two things. The HDP nexus is something that we highlight a lot. And then in particular, when it comes to the conflict prevention, the next 2 points are highly important. We need to have integrated approaches that make sure that the benefits that we give to our development projects are not just going to the displaced persons, but also to the host communities, so that there's not a competition for the support provided by the development communities. And we also know, and this is also what I'd like to highlight again, it needs to have a participatory approach in order for the displaced person to be able to communicate their particular needs so that these can be taken into consideration. So it's not just the communication, it's also taking into consideration possible means and ways to integrate or ensure participation in a broader decision-making process. Next slide, please. The illustrative case that I've promised you to bring into this discussion is from Bangladesh. It's the first project funded by the German government that looks into climate migration and urban development specifically. We have a budget of about 15.5 million euros and work in 47 slums in 5 cities in Bangladesh. Our main objectives is to improve the living conditions of climate migrants and other vulnerable urban poor in these slum areas, whereby we follow an integrated livelihood approach. So livelihood is the key focus on this project. So what are examples of specific livelihood challenges of climate migrants in Bangladesh? I mean, we know they receive little support from local government in terms there's a number of access barriers when it comes to public social services which are available but which cannot be accessed by climate migrants. We know they struggle tremendously when it comes to accessing the urban labor market. We see that there's a lack of skills that are required in the urban context, which these climate migrants don't bring. And we also know that they are highly exposed to climate risk, in particular when they settle in slum areas, which are prone to flooding, in particular in the Bangladesh case. A good precondition that we have in the Bangladesh case is that the political leadership is highly aware of the challenges of climate migration and that there's a political commitment to address this. The example very much focuses on a participatory and integrative approach that I would like to bring from this project, which is part of our donor harm strategy. And perhaps you could just go to the next slide. A key success factor when it comes to this participative, innovative, integrative approaches is to work with so-called community development committees. This is democratically elected committees which were initially set up in the framework of a UNDP project, and after the completion of this project we have taken this up and further increased the coverage of community development committees. Basically, we see that this is a very valuable entry point into these communities, which are somewhat elusive. And for formal actors, I'd say, including us as GIZ and the ward councillors. So we sometimes struggle to identify the right persons to talk to, which really have a mandate to represent the communities. And I think this is the beauty of this community development committees. And this provides for what I've mentioned, this integration approach, which very much in our case, for instance, is geared towards involving the community, not just in interventions such as, communicating what we have in mind and what the particular objectives of the project are, but also to make sure that the benefits that we provide and the target of the project is also given to the community as a whole and not just to the community of the climate migrants. And in terms of the participation, we see that this is an efficient means to make sure that the community can also be included in decision making when it comes to, for instance, the selection of beneficiaries, so those that are in particular in need, but also we can tailor our approaches to the particular needs of the community. So what exactly do they need in terms of livelihood support, and then we can actually draw from that in communication with this community committees. A positive effect that we also see is that in our cases we have a high share of women amongst the CDC members. So usually these community development committees consist of about 4 to 5 persons, and in some cases we have even more than 70% of women that participate. And this is in particular important because we see that amongst this group of climate migrants, women are the most vulnerable, and they lack in particular access to livelihood options, and in that case they're very much exposed to various risks that are related to this. Okay, perhaps let's go to the next and last slide. I just wanted to show you the different areas of intervention in which we work and where we have successfully been profiting from this cooperation with the CDC. So we're doing TVET training, so technical vocational educational trainings to improve the skills, which is linked to certain measures to improve the access to finance and businesses. We're also providing direct cash support, where we're also working in close cooperation with the CDCs, in particular when it comes to selecting the beneficiaries of these direct support measures. And we're also piloting now a participatory planning approach, social lab approach, where we will be engaging with further actors, including the CDCs, such as the private sector, to bring them in, as well as municipal actors, in order to plan and later then provide the ground for the implementation of further poverty reduction measures. And we're also advising the ministry on the improvement of the access to social services for the climate migrants. And here we work also through direct contact with the CDCs. So we're building a link between the decentral structures of the ministries and the CDCs, so that also the information on how to access public social services can be communicated in a very efficient way into the slums, and also how the CDCs can help the slum dwellers to be directed towards the centers where such applications can be done. So thanks a lot. I will conclude my presentation here, and I look forward to your comments and questions. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks, Karen. And I'm to say it's a really impressive program. I mean, before my current position, I worked in the UK government, and it was actually very difficult to persuade what was then DFID to think about the challenges that municipal governments have in handling humanitarian situations like large movements of forcibly displaced people. There's a tradition among many donors to work more at the national level than a municipal level, but actually, as we know, and the work of IRC has highlighted this, that it's actually municipal authorities that are at the forefront responding to these types of crises. But as you point out, they have a constrained mandate. They may have very limited funds that they can draw on, and they might be constrained by the types of national level legislation and policy that's in place. So it's great to highlight how important their role is, but also the limitations. And I think the Bangladesh case is a really, really fascinating one, and it's a situation where I think we assume that there's going to be continued movement into urban centres as flooding increases, and as we have in more and more extreme weather events affecting coastal communities. So certainly this work to help prepare municipal authorities, and to do so in a way collaborating with local people and organised communities is really important to kind of, to be ready. So we've got our final presentation now, which is going to be a little bit different. This is going to be from Jay Patel, who is the co-founder and CEO of Enlight Institute. So that's a startup focused on solving the last mile human capital challenges of clean energy companies in rural Uganda through recruitment, training and coaching services. And Jay is also a co-founder at Village Energy, a USAID-funded Ugandan solar distributor focused on productive use. So that's custom solar installations for rural businesses, institutions and agriculture. And he's going to give us some examples from his recent work that perhaps try and show how we can sort of think differently about alternative energy sources in urban areas. Thanks, Jay.
Thanks so much, Lucy. Excited to be here. So I'm going to talk go through a few slides just on some of the trends that we're seeing in terms of the opportunities around solar in urban contexts, in terms of how we can move forward to address so many of the issues that have been raised by my fellow panelists, and conclude with a 3-minute video case study, which kind of, I think, will bring a lot of these themes together. So next slide. So the first thing to know is that energy access really matters for African cities. Like, we think about energy access as a rural problem only. And it's true that in rural, like in Uganda specifically, where I spent 4 years, more than 90% of rural populations lack access to energy, but almost 50% of Kampala's population also lacks consistent access. And so it matters for refugees who are coming into these urban contexts. It also happens for people living in slum communities, and is a problem that has been not addressed as much as the rural area, but something that really, really matters. And so that's something that at Village Energy we're taking a look at. Second, productive use of energy, by which we mean that energy that is not for household consumption, but for businesses and institutions. That's the real opportunity that's really emerging right now. So this picture that I'm showing you is Village Energy. We installed the first factory-sized solar installation in Uganda. It's a 150 kilowatt system for processing coffee, and it was made for New Cafe, which represents over 50,000 coffee farmers, and there's processing for them around the country. And so it's so productive use in these urban areas is a job creator, and it's also something that is impacting supply chains. And we're going to see more and more of that start to come up in Kampala, in surrounding communities, and we see this as creating jobs. The third thing is that energy delivery is going to be different for urban versus rural. In rural, we have a lot of big focus on home systems, and for individual households. So you might have like a 10-watt panel, 3 lights, and every household's going to have their own little system. We also see a lot more microgrids, which is that you might have like maybe 20 or 30 kilowatt solar installation that powers, say, 50 households. In urban context, where the grid is much more prevalent, there's going to be a lot more focus on distribution through, for example, batteries. So picture here is one of the technicians from Village Energy is installing batteries for a school. So this particular installation is off grid, but in urban communities, we're seeing a lot more business models emerging around battery banks, where you actually almost like you deliver the milk, delivering milk from 50 years ago. You're going to be delivering that day's electricity into urban communities that can use it. This is better in areas where theft is a big problem, where you're not going to have as much rooftop space for people to put panels up. And this is really going to be important for driving energy access into these slum communities, where in fact a lot of the economic activity in places like Kampala actually happen. Next slide. So the job creation is multi-layered. So at Enlight Institute, we started a solar technician academy, and this is actually our first graduating class. And so we think about, what does job creation through solar look like? So first off, we think about solar technicians and sales agents, and these are the people who are direct stakeholders in the value chain of energy delivery. But then we also think about a much broader spectrum, which is what is the job creation that can be accelerated through having access to electricity. And this is a big issue that's coming up, for example, in refugee communities, particularly settlements outside of the capital, where there's a growing interest in how can we turn these refugee settlements into urban communities themselves, real productive areas of opportunity. And so some of the big opportunities are in agriculture in particular. In urban, so in terms of how do you increase agricultural yields and reduce post-harvest crop loss, as well as supply chain cold storage. So there's all sorts of stuff. They've done some interest. I know IAED has done some studies in terms of fisheries on the lakes of Lake Victoria, and how setting up a freezer for storing fish has actually helped to really increase economic opportunities for many of the women who are collecting the fish. So there's a lot there. And then lastly, stakeholder engagement is really key. In Uganda, if you're able to involve local government, and even national government, makes a huge difference. So for giving an example, during COVID, Village Energy, in partnership with Signify Foundation, which is also known as Philips Lighting, was able to install solar installations at over 40 health centers across the country. And we were able to do this in partnership with the Ministry of Health. And the first place that we installed streetlights in to increase safety was at the ministry's headquarters in Kampala. So on the left, you can see, what was it before, and on the right, you can see what's after. And so this is an example of if we work with government and we show them the benefits, they can help us to really scale this up across the country. Next slide. So this last one is a video. You may want to just watch your sound because it's some dramatic music, but it was a case study that was created by the team at Village Energy. And just to give you some background on this market called Kajansi is about 15 kilometers outside of Kampala. It's actually on the road to the airport. And it's gone through a lot of redevelopment. A lot of migration has meant that what was once a peri-urban community is now pretty much an urban community. It's been facing a lot of challenges with the new highway. But working with the Dutch government and also with local government, which co-finance the system, and a bunch of other government institutions, over 2 years, we were able to negotiate get the funding for and install a 4 kilowatt installation. And just to conclude, this video will give the, in the own words of the people in the community, what it's done for them. So if you want to press play. I don't think we can.
Audio preview.
tuligagendanga ne tukoleeza bukando be buzikira bakasitoma ne batuyitako.
This is Kajan's market. We call it Kajan's Daily Market in Kajan's Town Council, Wakiso District. It's on an Entebbe Road, 8 kilometers from Kampala. We have about 300 plus vendors in the market, and we get roughly 500 or more customers daily, on a daily basis. Outside, you have people who work from outside, they work all night.
Mazemu emyaka 18 n'emyaka gyonna gye tumazeeko nga tukolereza Saga n'amasannyalaze agafa ag'okusasula.
Twakozesanga amasannyalaze ago nga bbiiru ejjanga y'amaanyi ne tusanga obuzibu nga ssente olumu tezivaamu olw'embeera nti waalingawo okubbibwa kw'amasannyalaze eri abasuubuzi baffe. N'abasirikale baffe luli baali basanga ebiseera ebimu nga amasannyalaze gabeera gavuddeko agawumeme, tusanga embeera y'obuzibu, abakasoma ne bagenda, abasuubuzi baffe ne bakozesa kandoozi, olumu ate ne zituleetera obuzibu, zituleetera omukka omubi ne butadooba.
Kyali nga amasannyalaze gatera okuvaako n'okumaka tadooba ne kayiwa amafuta mu bintu n'obisuula, olina kusuubula ate birala kuba biri byakozeki yayiseemu amafuta.
Naye okuva lwe twafuna sola zituyambye kubanga tetukyasasula, amasannyalaze tegagenda.
They gave us 122 vendor lights, as you see in the stalls. They gave us 41 security lights, which you have seen around the building. They gave us 9 floodlights in the sides of the market. Then we got 6 street lights, which is giving us enough lights in Kajan's market. The vendors are very happy with the lighting which they have now.
Kati gano ge twafuna aga sola gatuyamba kuba tegavaako, gabeerako okola paka ssaawa 4 nga tegavuddeeko, ne bakasitoma ne beeyongera.
Tweyagala nnyo kuba kati tukyasobola n'okukola okuva ku makya paka kiro kuba ekitangaala tukirina.
Ate n'ebintu byaffe bikuumibwa bulungi kuba amasannyalaze gasula gaaka.
Even beyond this market, we are gaining from this village energy power, which we are getting from the solar system you gave us.
Indeed, we thank the village energy engineers who did their well-organized work. They did a job in a few weeks. They had completed the thing, and we are happy for them. Wherever we got a problem, we called them, they respond immediately.
Era twebaza nnyo aba village energy okutuwa amasannyalaze ago, beebale nnyo, beebalire ddala.
Thanks, Jay. It's great to see that. I think one of the points you made was that this is a place that used to be on the outskirts of the city, but it's growing. We know that Uganda is a country that's urbanizing very quickly. You have these big urban centers in Tebbe and Kampala that are growing, and that as to cope with that rapid urbanization, you need to come up with new types of solutions. And I want to jump straight into the Q&A and just go straight back to Jay and ask him a specific question. So we've sort of given this example of the types of interventions that are promoting a new green economy. How is it that we can do that in a way that's inclusive of refugees and migrants, or what are the barriers to those more vulnerable populations being involved in these new types of initiatives?
Yeah, I think that, kind of echoing everything the panelists have said, it takes a very holistic approach. In order to get productive use, we need not only the access to the power, which comes from, say, a solar system, but we also need, if you want the refugees to be starting businesses, you're also going to need access to capital. You're going to need training. You're going to need access to supply chains, and even language training. Keep in mind that many of these refugees are coming from very different language languages than are spoken by the locals, and that can pose some barriers. To give an example, I know that there are a bunch of Burundian refugees, a few hundred of them in Kampala, and they don't speak English or any of the local languages. They speak mostly French and languages from Burundi, and so that poses a barrier when they're trying to find jobs, even if they have the legal right to work, which they do, thanks to Uganda's really helpful policy. So I think it takes a very integrative approach that brings together all the stakeholders to design a holistic program that can really support them in all these ways. And I think that's really going to help them take advantage of these opportunities that are coming up.
Thanks, Jay. Can I ask all our participants to turn their videos on so we can see all of you? Thank you. Welcome back. We've got some questions coming through in the Q&A, which we were going to turn to now. So we've got about 15 minutes, so we haven't got long for questions. We're going to do our best to answer some of those. And I think actually one of the first ones that came through I thought was quite interesting. So I'm going to read this one out. This is from Daphne. So what do humanitarian organizations need from the donor community to expand climate resilient urban development and promote social cohesion? So that's a question that could go to probably any of you, but who would like to go first? Just stick up your hand and turn on your mics for that one. Kathleen Loon got there first. Go for it, Kathleen Loon.
Just very quickly in a few points, I'm happy for others to jump in, but there's an element of predictability there in terms of funding, because when we're looking at expanding climate resilient urban development, we're looking at systemic work, structural work that requires more than very ad hoc responses. So to me, there's an element of predictability. There's an element of supporting responses that are less reactive, because we're still in a world where, despite the fact that there is a recognition that we need to work towards achieving longer term and more sustainable impact, we're still very much in a reactive mode. So we will respond to emergencies, for instance, but everything that relates to, I mean, if we're speaking of resilience, we're speaking of reducing risks. And this speaks to anticipatory action quite strongly. I don't think we have the right balance for the time being between reactive responses and anticipatory action. And this is in part because of a humanitarian mindset, but this is also in part related to where is support being provided and for what type of responses. And I would really advocate for a shift towards much stronger anticipatory responses if we're going to be looking into how do we build resilience. Because I mean, we know that once people, systems, communities are hit, recovery is much longer. And therefore, that means that we need to be working beforehand, and we need to be working at the levels of individuals, of course, but also of systems and structures and so on. I'll stop there to let others develop, but that's a quick reaction to that question.
Yeah, just to follow on, Lucy, if I may, very linked to what Catherine Noon was saying, but I think the idea is really that the funding preemptive as well as being sort of flexible and longer term. I mean, I think in the humanitarian world, we're often getting very short-term funding and also very fixed to certain things. But I think the idea, and this is happening in some cases, and some donors are becoming more flexible and providing longer-term funding to sort of bridge immediate response into longer-term resilience.
Can I just add one thing on the social cohesion question? I mean, this relates very much to how we engage with communities. Who do we consider to be a potential recipient of support? And I mean, it's very clear that approaches now have aimed at being much more comprehensive and holistic rather than only targeting specific populations, recognizing that you also need targeted programs to address specific needs. But to me, there's that element. And several have stressed in their presentation those participatory approaches that are quite core as well to social cohesion. And I'll stop. Thank you.
Thanks. I want to come back to that point, but I think Ebru wanted to respond. Do you want to respond to the first question, Ebru?
Sure, just to add, just to complement what my colleagues, both Lamia and Catherine Liu, have already spoken about, that resilience is a long-term process. It doesn't have a real cut end to the projects because you can always do more to be able to improve on resilience. And just to give an example from the project that I just presented, we had funding for 2 years for that project and the other 2 cities that we worked in Latin America, but we were not able to see it through, like how the implementation went through afterwards. And even though like we were asking for funding, of course it didn't come through. But so I think like the funding agencies need to see that it just doesn't have a cut and like solution, that we have to see resilience. We have to understand that resilience will be a long-term process. Thank you.
Thanks, Ebru. There's a question that came up on the chat that I was also in the back of my mind. I mentioned it at the beginning when I was talking about how there might be different and combined triggers for people to move. And Catherine Noon also spoke a bit about that as well. But the question here is specifically for the Bangladesh case. So it's this question from Erling asking about who is considered a climate migrant in the Bangladesh case, and where do you draw the line between a migrant and a climate migrant, and why, and what implications that has for your work? It's quite a long question, there's quite a lot of questions in there, but Karen, do you want to respond to that one?
Yeah, please respond to this. I mean, this is very much, I mean, I think, Catherine, you've also mentioned this in your presentation, that there's no common definition of who is a climate migrant, who not. And now, as GIZ, who wants to deal with this issue, we need to have a definition, a working definition at least, in order to be able to target these climate migrants. So in the Bangladesh case, we also realized there was no definition with which was basically given by the government, and also the government is not very consistent in how to frame climate migrants, and sometimes it's referred to climate refugees, and this has also different implications of how the topic is being dealt with. What we understand is a very helpful approach is to consider basically each and everybody a climate migrant who is forced to move into the cities. I mean, we're talking about internal migration, we're not talking about international migration in our project, who is forced to move into the cities due to the loss of livelihood, so to say, in the framework of climate change. So for instance, if there was a flooding event, if there was, for instance, if you cannot continue with your agriculture activities, for instance, due to loss of arable land, erosion, what have you. So everything that kind of is environmentally connected to your displacement or to your migration to the city, in that case, you can be considered a climate migrant. I mean, we know that climate change, so to say, is just one factor that causes people to migrate. There's always multiple factors that come into this. And it's impossible to draw the line to say, in this case, climate change was the core or the principal factor. In this case, another factor was the most important. So you have to see this as one component of different factors that lead to the decision for a person to migrate. But we believe that once this, there is a certain indication that the environmental risks from climate change somehow have an impact on this, it's sufficient to have this person or this family to be considered a climate migration family. So what kind of implication does this have for our work? I mean, we're continuing to lobbying for a concise definition also at the policy level, so to say, because this is important in order to address this climate migration issue in a coherent manner. And we also call for, so to say, a pragmatic approach. I mean, we need to address climate migration related challenges now. And we somehow need to move and create certain solutions to the challenges that I've just referred to. And I think as we go along the way, we also learn more about climate migration, specific characteristics of these groups. And I think this can also be used as an input to further frame who is the climate migrant or not. And what we realize when we do our assessments in the slums and, for instance, ask who has a climate migration background, this is not a terminology with which people work on the ground. So we always have to explain what this means, and we rather ask, like, did you move because of, you know, any flooding event that kind of caused you certain hardship situation that led to the decision to migrate to the city? So we're actually going like this. And as I said, I mean, it's a pragmatic definition that we're having, but it's very helpful for the work. And I'd just like to add that in the slums in which we're working, 47 in total, we have about 50% of the population that confirms that environmental risks were a factor that led to the decision to migrate into the city. So this also underlines that there is already a very considerable number of persons in the urban slums that would consider themselves a climate migrant if you apply our definition.
Thanks, Karen. I think we've probably just got time for one more question, but I'm quite keen on this one. It's from Lucia. To what degree does rule of law and strength of institutions have an impact on your work in cities? There was a suggestion of this from the reference to gangs and also the weaknesses sometimes of municipal authorities. But let me throw this open to the panelists just for a last comment about how the rule of law and institutions affects your work.
I can go first. I can just say that operating as businesses in these countries and while following the law is extremely difficult. When people can defraud you and you don't have a hope of being able to go to the courts. Even with the government, when they agreed to pay for the system, we were really concerned of whether they would actually pay. And so the rule of law is one of the biggest hindrances to kind of doing the work that we do, and in part means that we have to take on a lot of tasks and take a lot of securities that does add costs to what is already a hard to finance project. So absolutely, it's something that the more that we can strengthen it, the easier it's going to be for us to implement in our programs.
Ebru, did you want to jump in there?
Sure. Actually, I was thinking about, as you were asking this question, I was thinking about the second project that the community decided to develop, that it thought it would have a big impact in the equitable development and climate resilient development of their city. That would be to change the development zoning for in the southern hill. But at the same time, they understood that it was not feasible under the conditions of gangs having such a big importance or having a big say in contrary to, you know, because the gangs did not want it was beneficial for them to have these developments. So it was not possible under the conditions, but at the same time, the community thought that they could just start this conversation with the city, because given that they have just in a way got some empowerment with this project, have become increased their awareness to climate change, and so they could at least start a conversation. But it's definitely it definitely was one of the main problems in Santa Ana and in other locations as well in Central America.
Thank you, Ebru. I think it's time to wrap up. Let me, unless it's really quick.
No, I was just going to say that having informal organizations also, even if you don't have strong formal institutions, having those informal networks and associations can help link to sometimes to the formal networks for justice or other services. So I think that's important as well. Thanks.
Thank you. So I mean, I've got less than a minute to wrap that up, and that's quite a tall order. I suppose what I would want to sort of get across from these discussions is that the complexity of the urban environment, urban systems, governance, the social complexity, and the economic complexity of what makes a city. So work on migration into urban areas and climate change in urban areas is in some ways not to be taken lightly. It's not simple, but it's becoming more and more urgent. And I think we can see just from what's happening around us every day that these sort of pathways, these movements into cities are not going to stop, and that it is where people want to be and where they think they're going to be safe. But there's a lot of work that needs to be done to make sure that they are. And I think this issue of scale, of thinking about working at the city scale and supporting city institutions is really critically important. And I think maybe what we need to do is like go back to what Catherine Loon said about the predictable funding, being less reactive and thinking more about how we're going to build the resilience of cities, communities, and people's leaders so they can deal with the inevitable new arrivals in cities and prevent those people being at further risk when they seek safety in towns and cities around the world. So just all I'd like to do now is thank the IRC for convening and organising this panel, in particular to behind the scenes, Tara Clarkin and Annalene Voss. No one can see you, but we know you're there. So thank you for your support and organising us and bringing us all together. For me, it's been great to work with some of you again and to meet new panelists. So I think that's it. And thanks very much and goodbye.